We are looking to wrap up Siman Pei Zion Sif Aleph, looking to wrap up the end of our discussion of chapter 87, halacha number 1, when it comes to Basar b'chalav. Again, that's Yoreh Deah, 87.1. And we're going to wrap it up by having a little discussion about the difference between Basar b'chalav and other prohibitions. And I'm going to break up this last year by rounding out our discussion on the halakha itself, and then that'll be followed up with a separate video that is just the tamtzit halakha, the basic laws that we learn from this seif. So what is the difference? So let's talk about it for a second. So meat that comes from a kosher animal and it is mixed with milk, and they come together in a hot pot that cooks them, these two things become prohibited from eating them and from benefiting from them. And this law is a Torah prohibition. Okay? This is not the same level of Torah prohibition applied to other things prohibited by the Torah. The only thing that comes close would be chametz on Pesach, which is prohibited from benefiting from it. Similarly, orla, that's also something prohibited for both of these things. And kilai hakerem, these are all food items. The only other things that are non-food items are avodah zarah, so something that is used in the practice of idol worship, but you're not eating it. Now, food that was used in the purpose of that could be, however, the prohibition on benefiting from it is an extension that goes beyond the actual consumption, but even attaches itself to those activities that could lead to consumption. That's the benefit. And also a shor niskal, which is the dangerous bull that goes out and attacks somebody and is sentenced to death. It is prohibited from benefiting from it. So let's take a little bit of a deep dive into understanding this. So by Basar b'chalav, the prohibition falls on the action of cooking itself, and that action of cooking it is the Torah prohibition. And there's no other prohibition that functions like this in Torah law. Okay? And the other thing that we kind of learned is that we don't see an actual prohibition attached to a punishment by cooking it. We know the Torah prohibits it, but unlike, let's say, eating treif meat or eating nevela meat, it attaches to malchus, attaches to lashes by Torah law. That's not the same case here with Basar b'chalav. Another interesting thing is that there's a concept that is created by cooking milk and meat together. We call it in the Talmud chaticha nasis nevela, okay, or chaticha atzma nasis nevela. It's something the Talmud explains to us is the unique category created by cooking these two things together. And that means that the piece of permitted meat is now made to take on the status like nevela. Nevela, the Torah says that you shouldn't eat that, and this piece of meat takes on that same status. Now, if it's if it's done through cooking and it absorbs milk into it. So, and there's also where there's not shishim. I will learn later on how important having 60 against it. Just since people kind of know that there needs to be 60 times against it. There's not 60 times against it of volume. So then all that piece of meat turns from a permitted piece of meat to a prohibited piece of meat. And if that piece of meat falls into another pot, and you can taste the taste of the Basar b'chalav in the next pot, so then the Torah requires you to have more than 60 times against the initially prohibited piece of meat in the second one and the entire pot as well. Okay? And not just against the milk that it absorbs. So if you were able to separate the two, it's not the volume of the absorbed milk, the whole piece of meat becomes prohibited. So if you have 1 ounce of meat that fell in, then 1 ounce of meat that goes into the next one. You need 60 plus ounces to calculate against it in order to say that the next pot would be permitted, and less than that, the next pot would be prohibited. So the whole amount of meat that falls into the original hot milk becomes a brand new piece of prohibited object and is not subject to only the amount of milk absorbed inside of it, assuming you could measure that. Now, by other prohibited items, there is a difference if we say this or not. Okay? And even those people who say that it does apply to other prohibited items, that extension is only a rabbinic extension of that law. So the Shach actually says later on, writes this in Simon Sadi Beis, he says the reason why this works this way is for the following reason. Is because Basar b'chalav, each one of them, I have kosher meat, I have kosher milk, right? Each one of them on their own is fine. And now, when they come together, they make a prohibition. So therefore, they make everything prohibited. So even the milk becomes all prohibited, and that's the thing. So if you were cooking, let's say a pot of milk, let's say you're warming up 9 ounces of milk because you're going to drink some hot milk, right? And then the next thing you know, 1 ounce of cholent meat falls into that pot. Oh, you've avoided. But now the milk that's there, that's now 9 ounces of prohibited substance. So if it mixes in, if you try to pour it back into any other milk, it's going to prohibit it. Okay, because those 9 ounces are now a new isser. And same thing too with the 1 ounce of meat. Okay. There's another important part of this that attaches to it, where the flavor itself that's created in making basar b'chalav, this new flavor where the meat and milk mix together to make a new flavor, this is creating a prohibition on exchanging that flavor into something else, which then affects the next item. This concept is known as ta'am ke'ikar. The flavor of the thing is the same thing as the thing. So if it imparts the flavor, it takes on its prohibited status. Okay, so with other prohibitions, they're not really sure if the Torah says that this is the same thing. And there are really 4 opinions about this. And we will revisit this over the course of Basar b'chalav, and as the Hashem, if we get to Tav it's also interesting over there as well. So in the Rishon, there's 3 important opinions. So there's Rashi, there's Rabbeinu Tam, there is the Rabbeinu Eliyahu, and there is the Ri Orleans. Okay, so let's go through the different opinions over here. So Rashi's opinion is brought down in the Gemara in Chulin. It's on Sadi Ches Amud Beis. And he says in the Gemara over there that Rava says Tam Ikar is Midrabanan. Okay, so he says that if it were a Torah prohibition, it would be Batal Barov. It would be nullified in the majority of other things around it. Okay, and he's not alone in this. He's joined by the Ran as well. This Ran is on the pages of the Rif if you want to look it up, and it's on the first page of Perek Gid HaNashe. Okay, so it's on that page of the Rif, and in the Ritva brings it on this page as well. He agrees. There's also the opinion of Rabbi Eliyahu, Aaron Alevi, He writes this in the Sefer Beta Kabayis. This is in the 4th section of it. And this is also the Ramban as well. Okay? So what's interesting is that interestingly enough, is the Rosh was not happy with him making that comment on his book. He writes this in the book Beta Kabayis, which is written as a commentary to the Sefer, to the Sefer Torah Sabayis of the Rashba. We'll get back to that in a second. Okay, the next opinion is Rabbeinu Tam, who says Tam Ki'ikar is D'Oraisa. Right, it's on the same page as Rashi, and he's talking about the same opinion of Rava, and he disagrees. Okay, and he says that you are actually held liable for lashes for eating the flavor, just like everything else. Okay, even if you're not eating the flavor within one sitting, which is called achilas pras, kazayas b'kadei achilas pras, meaning that you normally have to eat the prohibited amount, which we established is a kazayas. You have to eat that kazayas within one sitting. One sitting means that enough time would take you to sit and eat a piece of bread. And that time ends up being about, let's say, 5 minutes. Maybe it's 9 minutes. Maybe it's 3 minutes. It's something around that time period. So even if it doesn't satisfy that, if you eat that amount of flavor, you are still violating the Torah prohibition. Okay, and that's Rabbeinu Tam. Okay, and there are a lot of people who tend to agree with him. And that's what the Rashba says himself in the book Torah Sabayas, in that same 4th section that we were mentioning a moment ago. And it's actually if you have a standard edition of Torah Sabayas, it's on page 11, and you can access that. Either you can get the Sefer in your local base medrash, or you can find it on HebrewBooks.org. I recommend the Sefer Torah Sabayas. It's actually a very interesting read on halacha from the Rashba, and the going back and forth between him and the Ra'ah is very interesting. Okay, so I have a whole list here of people who agree with this. Zachariah Levi, the Ravid, in the Sefer Mitzvah Gadol, he quotes it as well. The Tur says a similar thing in Simon Sadi test later on, and so on and so forth. And the Rosh himself, back in Yidinasha, okay, back in that same chapter mentioned the Ran earlier, in Rashi, he says this in Simon Lamed Aleph, that he says both of them, and he doesn't choose one over the other. Okay, so that's the second opinion. Let's take a look at the third and fourth opinions now. That's kind of interesting. So Rabbi Rimi Orleans, he says that, yes, I agree with the Rabbeinu Tam, but you don't get Malchus. Okay. Right, so he says it's a different reason. Why? We're not going to sit and learn Sefer Chula right now. That's interesting to note. Okay, so now the Rabbeinu Eliyahu, okay, which is a very long Tosfos and a lot of different answers explaining this Gemara. The Tam Ke'ikr is deraisa, like the Rabbeinu Tam says, but you have to get a kazayas b'kedei achilas pras. So he disagrees with the amount of time you need in order to consume it. He agrees that it has to be done within that limited amount of time. And that's why you're violating Torah prohibitions, because you have consumed it within that amount of time. So you are basically getting the same prohibition from the same amount of food. Okay? So he says this is by other types of prohibited substances, but Basar b'chalav, Tam Ke'ikr is something that the Torah mandates, because they're saying that the flavor of the one goes into the other and turns into a new prohibited substance. Okay? So that's why it's something new. Okay, so Halach L'Maisa, the Prima Gadam, takes a look at this, and he says that by all prohibited substances, there is no attachment of a punishment on them when you eat them normally, like we talked about in our last year. And Basar b'chalav, we said that even if you eat it abnormally, you're still violating it, okay? Because it has, as long as it has been mixed together, it's still considered something that has to be destroyed, and you can't even eat from it even when it tastes kind of bad, unless it's completely destroyed in and of itself. Okay, because we said it, Basar b'chalav is prohibited not because you're benefiting from it, but because it's benefited from in normal fashion. And the Rambam extends this to Kilai Kerem as well, but that's just sort of a note. So that's something interesting about Basar b'chalav. Okay, now by other prohibited foods that we don't have a stringency of chaticha havra or yelis kabed. Okay, when it absorbs a flavor. So there's a prohibition on prohibited food substances that when it becomes something large enough that I would serve it to you, like a chicken leg or a chicken breast or a steak. And if I would serve something of that size to you at a meal and it just absorbs some prohibited flavor, well, I really shouldn't say that if I got mixed in with other things, it is considered batal barov, that the majority should win in such a case. Okay, because it's too big. It makes itself too well known. Okay, now that's only when something is an absorbed flavor. We'll learn about this later on in later chapters. Now, so for example, if you have kosher chicken, right? Let's say you have a kosher chicken breast, and it absorbs some prohibited flavor, right? Let's say it absorbs some pig fat flavor, okay? That will make it prohibited from eating it, all right? Let's say they cook it together. So you can't eat it. Why? Because it has pig fat in it. But we don't say that it's not allowed to become batal barov, even if you mix 1,000 pieces together, which is the general rule of chadicha haroyes kaved. Okay, that's an exception. But when it comes to basar b'chalav, then this rule would apply. Okay, so that's something that's one big significant difference. So the Shach also says that when it becomes prohibited by basar b'chalav, that when we talk about Rolis Kave, which is later on in Siman Kuf Aleph 101. So since the basar b'chalav is considered its own prohibited substance, meaning I've cooked them together, they are now considered a piece of basar b'chalav. That's why we extend the rabbinic prohibition of Rolis Kave to it, but not in our case of, let's say, a piece of chicken that absorbs some pig fat flavor. And so that's why it's really important to understand the difference when we talk about Tam Ke'ikr, that we don't extend that prohibition to an absorbed flavor, while to this one we do. And so that's something that'll be interesting to learn later on. So we learned about those rules, Rolis Kaves in Kuf Aleph, and the issue of Isser Bittul, saying that this is not batal, is discussed in Kuf Tes 109. Okay, so as Hashem, maybe we'll get to those and look at this more intently, but just know that this implies the basar b'chalav. Pri Megadim continues to write, again in the introduction. So there's another issue that's debated in the Rishonim as to whether or not you could, technically speaking, by Torah law, suck out the prohibited flavor and return it to be a permitted thing. So we basically hold that that's not possible, because the Torah has taken this thing and turned it to something prohibited. So even though if I could technically remove all of the prohibited flavor from it, I can't return it to a permitted status. Okay? Now, for other prohibited things, technically speaking, since they are only rabbinically prohibited, therefore I could technically take out the prohibited flavor and return it to be permitted. It's just that it's difficult to do, or nigh impossible. So that creates the following situation: that if a piece of kosher food absorbs a prohibited flavor and becomes prohibited, and then you cook it in water, okay, and something else, right, or just let's say parve things, right, some vegetables, whatever, but there's 60 times against it. So let's take our chicken that was cooked in pig fat, okay, and there's 60 times against that. So we don't say that even though the flavor of the chicken is considered nullified in the rest of the water and vegetables, and the flavor of the pig fat doesn't leave the chicken piece itself. Okay, and which also further means that we don't say that the flavor is batal in the chicken and the chicken is now permitted. Okay, the prohibited piece of chicken remains prohibited, but only as a rabbinically prohibited substance. So if it goes ahead and falls into something else, and then there's not 60 times against it, then the second item is prohibited rabbinically, as meaning you can't eat it as a rabbinic stringency. However, basar b'chalav, no matter how many times you cook it, and the things that you attach to it, it offers everything forever and ever and ever as a Torah law. Okay? And so since that's a Torah stringency, the Torah's law applies here, everywhere, ad infinitum. Okay? And that's a Torah prohibition. Okay? So that's because we take the opinion of most people that efshar l'sochto, this idea of taking the flavor out of it is only a rabbinic prohibition. Now, the Prima Gunner is going to write later on in Simon Sadi, okay, and he's going to be joined by the Chavas Das, who writes this in Simon Sadi Beis, that is actually a Torah prohibition. And the reason why is because the Torah actually itself was concerned that the flavor stays inside, not a rabbinic one. And so in such a case, it won't make a difference between Basar B'chalav and other prohibitions, but we'll look into that more as we go on to see the difference of opinions later on about Efshel Sochto when we get into Taruvos. Okay, but just know that by Basar B'chalav this applies on all cases, that when you cook it in one thing and it falls into something else, and the material that you cook it in falls into something else, it prohibits that thing. Another difference is that since this is a Torah level prohibition, there is a difference between how we judge a question of whether or not something was cooked. Suffolk bishul. Do we know for a fact this was cooked or not cooked? Okay, so if it was a kli rishon, if the pot was sitting on top of the fire, okay, and we don't know if it got cooked, everything becomes prohibited because of the suffix, okay, if we're not sure. So, but if we're not sure if it fell into a kli sheni, right, you take it out of the first one, you plop it into a bowl, and we're not sure if it fell into it or not, okay, and it's something that's like a clear liquid, you can see there's no meat left into it, so that is a permitted suffix for Basar B'chalav, because kli sheni is only a situation where it draws the flavor out but isn't really cooking it, and so that's why it would be okay. But by other prohibitions, since it may go back and forth, by suffix in a kli sheni, it'll be prohibited. Okay? So the differences between these two things is that by other prohibited items, you already know that the kli sheni absorbs the flavors back and forth. Okay? So, but by Basar B'chalav, there's no real prohibition because there's no cooking going on. Okay? And so therefore everything is permitted. And so therefore you need full cooking. But the kli sheni doesn't do any cooking. Okay? And so therefore it's only rabbinic, and that's why we can allow on the suffix of it. But other prohibited substances, where the prohibition of having that item itself is prohibited. Okay? So, and we're not sure if that flavor has gone into it or not, we therefore have to assume that that's a prohibited flavor that went into it. Okay? So another thing is that's by Basar B'chalav, is that they're prohibited only because of maris ayin. So those things are, for example, that Basar B'chalav is a problem if you have other types of chalav. So let's say you had something that technically would be parv, like a woman who has expelled milk from herself, okay? Or if it was, if you have milk that was mixed with regular milk from a cow that was mixed with milk that was made from almonds, like almond milk, okay? Something like that. So the Shach says that you shouldn't mix these things together and eat them together, unless you can demonstrate that they were clearly cooked with something that was permitted. And same thing too by other prohibitions, unless you can demonstrate that they were made with permitted substances. There is a problem of maris ayin in those cases. Okay, we're concerned that you might be doing something prohibited. The next thing is that by Basar B'chalav, if you have these things together, okay, eaten on a table, so one guy's sitting eating a meat meal, and one guy's having a dairy meal, so they have to put some space between themselves, okay? However, if a non-Jew and a Jew are eating at the table together, there's no reason to do that, and the reason why is because there is no reason why you would think to extend your hand to take something from the non-Jew, because he's clearly eating something that's not kosher. So, but where something is kosher, even though it's dairy, that's a problem. Okay. And one final thing is that chametz on Pesach, Okay? And when you've taken a vow against something, okay, even though it's permitted for other people, you have vowed against it. In those situations, you have to make a space between yourself and another person, even a non-Jew, because these things that technically could be eaten. So if you see them eating like Oreo cookies, I want to take an Oreo cookie, right? But it's Pesach, so you need to put a space in between you and yourself and him. Okay. Um, Yep, and so anytime that you see anything that is a clear prohibited item that you might yourself not stay away from, you have to put your space between yourself and something else. And one example I have written down over here is from the pre-Toar. He actually points out that if the fruit is orla, right, it grew within it's been picked and served the first 3 years. So, we don't eat it, but you would notice that while looking at it. So with this, we come to an end of discussing Sif Aleph in the laws of Basar Chalav, and we will do another follow-up video to discuss the practical halachos that come from this. But with this, we'll move on to Sif Beis, and it'll go a little bit faster. We really took a big, deep dive into understanding the prohibition of Basar Chalav. Thank you for joining, and I look forward to sharing more of this learning with you in the future.